Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And sorry I was gone for a week. I had a little bit of heat exhaustion last week, and after a couple of days of not getting the review out, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to keep my schedule and release it next Saturday. It'll be fine. But today's review will be about The Story of Stone by N.M. Browne. So my sister sent me this book, and she had read it. I think she got it as a library cast-off, because I think that's where she gets most of her books, and there definitely was library binding on it, which I removed because I'm weird. But she had mentioned it to me a couple of times, and she's not someone who always brings up her reading, so I was like, okay, that's odd. And a couple of different conversations she brought it up, because she had rather mixed feelings while reading it, and ended up really liking it, but definitely wanted my opinion. And I have finished it, and I also have some mixed feelings, but I'm pretty sure I liked it. The Story of Stone is set in a world that I'm 90% sure is inspired by pre-Roman control Celtic mythology and world. We follow Neela, who is an apprentice findsman, which is basically an archaeologist, on an expedition to prove this blighted lake shore was the cradle of their civilization. They find a little black stone that when Neela touches it, it gives her visions of a woman in the distant past. A night hunter with the ability to sing life and maybe even death into things. Meanwhile, we are also following a young man named Jarrett, son of the chief of the Bearmen. Jarrett is one of dozens and dozens of sons, all vying for a place in the hierarchy of their brood. When Jarrett is put in charge of his twin brothers, he quickly realizes he will do anything to protect these children, even if that means using the magic that runs in the Night Hunter's blood to rewrite the world as they know it. How do these two stories connect? Read the book to find out. Okay, so there was a lot about this book that I really, really love. There are some really interesting things going on with the way gender is handled in this world. Neela has taken the oath of a non-woman, which means she cannot be married and is treated roughly as their society treats men. She's trying to be the first ever female findsman, and she is only able to pursue this path because she has declared herself not a woman, which she is only allowed to do because she has fits. Basically seizures, and is presumed to not be someone men would want to have a child with. Otherwise, she would have already been sold off into marriage years ago. And by the way, this does get a little bit more complicated as the book goes on, but this setup is a really interesting introduction to a third gender in a world that is highly gendered and highly patriarchal. And it doesn't end there. We also, in Jarrett's time, which is spoilers, not really spoilers, the past, there's the Bearmen Society, and they have non-women who are warriors, and they also have non-men. There's not that much explanation of how the non-men work in this society, but the implication is that these are men who have failed to establish themselves as warriors. They might have been taken, captive as, in battles or something, and so they're not going to be able to marry and have kids. They are relegated to being servants in the household they are attached to, and we end up with this society where only a lucky few men get to have a wife and kids, and only an unlucky few women have to have a husband and kids. And that's not my personal child-free bias going, oh, so sad that some of these women have to. No, the Bearmen Society have this insanely high maternal mortality rate, to the point that it's assumed that a wife is only going to last a few years before she has to be replaced because she is going to die in childbirth. And just as a side note, this is the second fantasy book I've read that explores an insanely high maternal mortality rate that must be fixed by magic and interbreeding with another fantasy race. In this book, it's because the babies are too big. In the other, it was that women were too small and they were built by the gods to be pretty, not to carry a child. And I feel like in both these stories, we are looking at this as metaphors of how women are asked to give everything to be mothers. And if we don't want to be mothers, society has often seen us as somehow not really women. The women in Jarrett's world even wear masks and are called the wife of the second quarter if they get married instead of their names. They literally lose their identity entirely in marriage. There's also a lot of examining women's agency in this book. There are a lot of moments where even the women who seem to have control of their own lives, who seem to be in a position of power, have that power suddenly turned against them, pulled out from under them, or they are blamed for things that they don't actually have control over. And it's interesting that the book introduces a lot of this to us in the past segments, and I feel like it was clearly expecting us to go, wow, the past in this world is so violent and primitive. But it's just as horrible in Neela's time as it was the previous time. Women are still being sold as brides without any say in the matter. There is still objectively slavery. And if anything, Neela's state as a non-woman is respected less than Hela's state as a non-woman in Jarrett's time. And there's just a lot going on here that explores gender norms, and I would say most of it is really interesting and really successful. And the other elements of the world building I feel like are also pretty interesting and mostly successful. We explore three main cultures in this book: the Bearmen, the Night Hunters, and the modern people, as in Neela's time period. And the Bearmen are undeniably the best fleshed out. We know what their society looks like, how the relationships work, what kind of buildings they sleep in, what days look like, what they eat, and what war looks like for them. And yeah, it's complex, it's got a hell of a lot of bad stuff to explore, and it's really not a cookie-cutter fantasy world. Like, this does not look like the fantasy of Tolkien and, the Belgrade or anything like that. We have a lot of just really interesting things going on. But the other two cultures, we only see three members of both of these cultures, really. The Night Hunters, we get Moon Eye, Stone, and Sky. And objectively, only Stone is anything like a fleshed out character. Like, we don't know if marriage is a norm in their society. We know they hunt and wear mostly leather, and we know they hunt deer, but beyond that, we don't really know what they eat. We know they are described as looking dark with black hair, but I'm not sure if that meant like jet black like a stone, or like brown skin, or just a dark tan, or as people often refer to the Black Irish, just having black hair. I don't know if their tribes are matriarchal, patriarchal, egalitarian. We know the singers are powerful, but are they the ruling body of their people? Is there a different ruling body? I get the feeling that they're not, but I don't have a clear defined answer. And what does a normal day look like for these people? And that can easily be excused for the Night Hunters because Stone is the only POV character that is a Night Hunter, and she gets the smallest portion of the book, and both Jarrett and Neela see Night Hunters as mysterious and other. It's logical that the narrative for their world is just gonna be a little bit less solid. But Neela's culture, yeah, we are told things about it, but we only see Neela, her father, the two other Findsmen, one of whom says maybe two things in the entire book, and then just completely vanishes out of the story about a third of the way through the book, and Moss, who both may or may not be from her culture. We never see what their cities look like, what they wear on a regular basis, what their normal daily lives look like, what peoples from different strata of their society look like. I don't know for sure if Moss's life before he became a bondsman would have looked anything like Neela's, or if they basically were from different cultures. Both him and Neela recognize a cultural barrier between them, but is it just because he's a bondsman, or is it a race thing? Like, how recently did he become a bondsman? It's pretty damn far into the book before we find out he wasn't born into it. I spent most of the book assuming that, yes, all the people with darker skin are born bondsmen, because it's not very clearly defined. We know he thinks of himself as a descendant of the Night Hunters and thinks that Neela is not. But why? Is it just appearances? Do they look similar? Is there like cultural strata stuff going on here? Are all the people who look more like Night Hunters bondsmen? Or if so, like, how do we get to this place from where Jarrett's society was in? And, like, I don't know if it's still common for men to have 4 wives in this society and to immediately replace one if one of them dies. I don't even know if the extreme maternal mortality rate is still a thing. I know magic is acknowledged to exist and that some of it is seen as evil because there was a passing reference to the fact that Neela's seizures could be interpreted as her being possessed or cursed. But we don't know if magic is a regular part of their society, if there are singers as a profession in this day and age, or if it's a societal role, or if it's common, if it's taught at universities, if it's the kind of once-in-a-lifetime skill that can be society-changing. We know so little about this society, except that it's patriarchal, and that they dye their hair and beards bright colors as a sign of rank. But even that detail, I'm not sure if that's just a Finesman thing or just a society-wide thing. And, like, the world building we get is great. It's strong, it's evocative, it's interesting. But there are just these huge gaps in it. And I really would have, I feel like this book would have been 90% improved with one scene taking place in Neela's normal life before they go on the expedition to paint the picture of what her world looks like. And I think part of the problem with the spotty world building stems from the structure of the book itself. We have 3 main POV characters, but they are not given equal portions of the book. Jarrett has probably about 60% of the book, and at first glance, Neela has about the remaining 40, but at least half of Neela's sections are visions of Stone, presented from Stone's POV, which just gives us a lot less time to learn about Neela and Stone's worlds. Which I feel is a bigger problem than just my personal feelings of unfulfillment, because one of the biggest questions this book is asking and revolves around is how the world got from the place it was at Jarrett's time period to Neela's. How it went wrong, and therefore how to fix it. And all we know about the wrongness of Neela's world, which is referenced, it's that people talk about the wrongness, but we know that there is slavery, but that also existed in Jarrett's time. We know that, women have pretty much no autonomy, but that was true of Jarrett's time as well. And we know that the lakeside is blighted, but it is pretty vague. And in the end, the only bit that gets even the vaguest explanation at all is the blight of Lakeside. And spoiler here, small spoiler, very small spoiler, but it basically just amounts to, we used bad magic, so the land went bad. And, I do want to talk about timelines and POV with this book, because there's a lot of really interesting things going on. I think this book is an absolute masterful use of voice in many ways. Each POV is written in a different rhythm, different complexity of sentences, and even different vocabulary. There are very clear defined different voices, while it all still feels like part of the whole. Stone's voice in particular is very, very strong. It's got these long run-on sentences, relatively simple sentence structure other than the run-onness, and pretty lyrical descriptions. And I'll be honest, it's not my favorite kind of writing. I was annoyed by it a bit. I feel like it was too much long, rolling sentences, especially when it's contrasted with Jarrett's, relatively simple sentence structure. He tends to speak or, be narrated about in short little segments. And I feel like my dislike of the prose around Stone's section made me dislike a character, Stone, who otherwise I think I would have really liked, but I feel like that's all really personal stuff. That's just not to my taste. And God bless, I just wanted there to be more commas. There needed to be more commas. Why were there not commas? It really bothers me where the fuck were the commas. But that aside, I also love the way that the timelines interacted with the different sections, because her sections in particular, Stone's sections, take an already back and forth timeline into a much more linear, non-linear, chaotic mode. The first scene we see from Stone is actually near the end of the actual story. And yes, most of her story is told in a linear manner within the visions, but it does not really directly line up with what's happening in Jarrett's time as well. And because we're also flashing back and forth between, the present and the past, it just creates this wonderful symphony of chaos when it comes to time. And I feel like writing nonlinear stories can be incredibly effective to like create tension by setting up moments of stress and then dropping us back to a calm moment, which imbibes that calm with a sense of foreboding. It can be used to point out elements of the story that contrast or are similar to each other in different time periods. And it can encourage the reader to pay a lot more attention to details that would have otherwise probably been easy to miss. And I think that the nonlinear storytelling in this book is used well for all of those effects. I do also want to talk about certain elements about two particular characters. Neela has seizures. Though they are described as fits, it's pretty clear that what we are talking about is what we would in the modern day call seizures. And these seizures scare people, they other her in her society, and they even scare her. Then they become associated with her visions. It's never directly said that her fits have anything to do with the visions or what allow her to have the visions or anything like that, but at least a couple of times it is directly stated that while she is having a vision, she has a fit. And her ability to have these visions make her special. It's unclear in the text whether this is something that would be unusual if there were more people around, if it would likely be somebody else who can have the same visions, or if it is just her. But because they happen at the same time, and they are the two things that make her sort of special, the fits and the visions sort of get accidentally, or maybe on purpose, directly tied to each other. And the implication in the end is that she is able to have the visions because she has fits. And then there's Ro. Ro drowns and is then brought back from the brink of death. And he's not the same boy. Before he was excitable, energetic, and brave. After he is quiet, physically weak, and strange. He went through a traumatic event, and then it's heavily implied that doing so gave him magic powers. He dreams of the dead, and huge portions of the plot revolve around Jarrett's desire to fix him. And, like, there's good in there. There's a lot of good in the way it's handled. We get a bit of examination about how the smallest things can make society reject you. We get the obsession with fixing people who are perceived as broken, and how that can feel like a rejection to the person. How even if you are just trying to make someone's life easier and make them happier, it can feel to that person like you are saying they aren't good enough. And the tying of their magic abilities to their physical and mental ailments, like, it's a really common trope in fantasy, and it can be seen as a way of empowering people with disabilities, but I know there are a lot of people out there who have a lot to say about this, and I've never really felt like I'm the person to break it down. So just know that that is a trope that exists in this book. If you have problems with it, it's there. Then there's the fact that Neela's seizures just sort of stop being part of the story at one point. Like, it's a plot thread that's just dropped and does not come back up. And Ro, really big spoiler here. This is a spoiler for near the end of the book. It is sort of a predictable spoiler, but it's a spoiler. He dies. And when his body is found, he is smiling. The implication throughout a huge portion of this book is this child is better off dead than weak, strange, and traumatized. Which is just a big oof moment. Like, okay. Not the best option in my personal opinion. And that finally gets me to the ending. And I'm going to try to talk about this with as few spoilers as possible, but I know there's going to be some things that I cannot be vague about. So if you have not read this book and want to, maybe, yeah, this is the moment to turn off the review, come back once you've read it. Okay, so I hope that all the people who are left with us already know how the book ends, or don't care. So, I'm sorry, I sort of hated the ending of this book. It was so anticlimactic. The big fix to the broken world is burying a rock. And yeah, Neela sings afterwards, magic, whatever, great, it's fine. Moss, who at this point still hasn't gotten more than the tiniest bit of character building or arc, gets the action that saves everything. And why? Because of his name. Like, he's the one that has to save the world because he's named Moss. And it's implied that there's at least one child in every generation named Moss. And, like, I really, really, really wanted something bigger here. This was supposedly fixing the magic that completely broke the world, that undermined the dream of the goddess, that ruined the unification of these two people, and it felt arbitrary, easy, and unexplained. It just is how we're gonna fix things. Why? Because this character had a vision that the goddess wanted this. And yeah, but why? Why would the goddess want this? Why does this make sense? I don't know why it's happening. Why would this be the one thing that allowed someone to sing back the forest into life? And is it going to fix anything else? Is, like, slavery gonna disappear from this world? Are women gonna have more power? Are women gonna stop having trouble with childbirth? Is that still a thing? Who knows? Why are Neela and Moss suddenly seemingly in love? Like, why? I don't get the whys of the end. And, like, Jarrett has his own little separate climax, and it feels forced in its own special way. Jarrett and Stone treat battle as inevitable when it is in no way actually inevitable. And so much of the story is about what is inevitable, about what is out of your control, what is fate, and how we blame ourselves for things that are out of our control. And that's fine, that's a really interesting thing to explore, especially when it's explored the way it is explored here, in a way of, like, looking at how culture, growing up in a certain culture convinces you that some things are possible and some things aren't. But, like, Jarrett had this plan to run away through, like, half the book. And as soon as it actually makes sense for him to run away, as soon as he has all the people he wants to run away with together, as soon as he has, you know, the supplies to do it, it doesn't even seem to occur to him that he could run at this point. And the spoiler of all, everything about the ending implies that the magic of last resort might have actually been the goddess's will in the first place. It might have been the right thing to happen. It might have been Jarrett and Stone's destiny, which completely muddies the water of the tragedy. Like, Jarrett forcing Stone to do that magic should be the tragedy. His refusal to accept Ro as he is, his refusal to give up and just leave, his willingness to use someone as a tool even while he had such strong feelings for her. These are a tragic flaw. But when we're then told over and over again that the magic was the only thing that brought these two races together, which has always been the dream of the goddess, and is something that the modern reader is definitely going to see as a positive, and that even allows the world that Neela lives in to exist, we're told that the magic did all this good. And so the book sort of has to pivot to committing to the idea that the magic of last resort was not what was wrong. It was the fire magic that was wrong, but we never actually get it directly stated. And, like, it could have been a really cool twist that everyone assumes it's the magic of last resort that's the problem, but then no, it's the fire magic. But every action that gets them from the magic of last resort to the fire is treated as completely inevitable. The only thing that they could have possibly done, which I don't personally like. I don't like it when fate overwhelms character choices and narratives, but I will give it this. It creates a feeling of less of a personal tragedy and more of a mythic tragedy. Because, yeah, one of the final things I want to say about this book, the story of Stone does an absolutely stellar job of feeling more like mythology than fantasy. And, like, that is something that's actually surprisingly hard to pull off. Like, I wrote and erased about 15 different paragraphs talking about what about it makes it feel more like mythology than fantasy. And every time I was like, that's not quite right. So it is an interesting trick to have pulled off. And this book also has some really strong voice, some really strong world building, interesting characters, cool themes, and I overall enjoyed it. There were just some things that annoy me, and they happen to be things that really annoy me. But overall, there's enough good in this book that if you were to ask me, do I recommend it? Yeah, definitely. Read this book. It's interesting. I just walked away mildly annoyed.